Crew. Well, we're together again. How about that? We're going to read a little bit more from Mr. Popper's Penguins. We're on chapter 16. Now, about my stand, sorry, it's an earthquake. Actually, the sun is out. The sun will come out today. So, here's the deal. Mr. Popper and the Penguins, they have put on a show for Mr. Greenbaum, and Mr. Greenbaum has decided, hey, awesome, I'm going to send you to tour the country, and they're going to go to all of his different theaters and perform their performance on stage for a lot of different crowds, and he's going to pay them $5,000 a week for 10 weeks. So, chapter 16 is called On the Road because they have to travel. Remember, they're starting in Washington State, and they're going to travel all across the country to all his different theaters. So let's see how it goes. During the next day, there was much to be done at 432 Proudfoot Avenue. There were new clothes to buy for all of them, and the old ones to pack away in mothballs. Then Mrs. Popper had to scrub and polish and straighten the whole place, for she was much too good a housekeeper to leave everything at 6s and 7s while the Poppers were away. 6s and 7s basically means she didn't want to leave the place a mess. Amy's kind of that way too. She's always worried somebody's going to show up and then it's going to be like, oh, they're going to say our house a mess. And most people walk in, they go, wow, I wish our house looked like this. And I'm going, yeah, I wish ours did too. Because usually our house is a mess too. I imagine yours is too, because you're living in there, so stuff gets cluttered. But Mrs. Popper, since they're going to be gone, doesn't want people coming in and saying, what that messy housekeeper she is. So they clean it up before they go. Mr. Greenbaum sent them their first week's pay in advance. Ooh. The first thing they did was to pay off the man who had installed the freezing plant in the basement. He had been getting rather uneasy about his money. And after all, without him, they could never train the Penguins. Next, they sent a check to the company who had been shipping the fresh fish all the way from the coast. At last, everything was done. And Mr. Popper turned the key in the door of the little house. They were a little late arriving at the railway station on account of the argument with the traffic policeman. The argument was on account of the accident to the 2 taxi cabs. With 4 Poppers and 12 Penguins, not to mention the 8 suitcases and pail of water with a live fish for the Penguins' lunch, Mr. Popper found that they could not all fit into one cab. So he had to call a second one. Each of the taxi drivers was eager to be the first one to get to the station and surprise the people there by opening the door of his cab and letting out 6 penguins. So they raced each other all the way, and in the last blocks, they tried to pass each other, and one of the fenders got torn off. The traffic officer naturally got very much annoyed. It sounds like sometimes when after recess, you guys are hustling over to my desk because you need to tell me who got in trouble with Mrs. Taylor, or who was pushing her talking in line. Doesn't it sound like it? Mr. Dugan! And then, darn, I wanted to tell him, right? Well, that's what they want to tell the good news first. So, here they go. The train was about to pull out of the station when they arrived. Even with both taxi drivers helping them through the gate and over the brass rails onto the rear observation platform, they barely made it. The Penguins were gasping. It had been decided that Mr. Popper should ride in the baggage car with the Penguins to keep them from getting nervous, while Mrs. Popper and the children should ride in one of the Pullmans. Pullmans would be cars where there's seats to sit in and beds and stuff like that, whereas Mr. Popper's going to ride in almost like a semi-trailer looking, just a box car. It's just basically empty except for he and the Penguins, and I'm guessing some ice for them. Because of getting on at the observation end of the train, Mr. Popper had to take the birds through the whole length of the train. It was easy enough to get them through the club car, even with a pail of fish to carry. In the sleeping cars, however, where the porter was already making up some of the berths, there was trouble. The porter's ladders offered too much temptation to the Penguins. What do the Penguins like to do with ladders? Yeah. Climb up and toboggan down. There were a dozen happy orks from a dozen ecstatic beaks. Poppers performing Penguins, completely forgetting their discipline, fought to climb the ladders and get into the upper berths. Poor Mr. Popper. One old lady screamed that she was going to get off the train, whether it was going 90 miles an hour or not. A gentleman wearing a clergyman's collar suggested opening a window so that the Penguins could jump out. 2 porters tried to shoo the birds out of the berths. Finally, the conductor and the brakeman with a lantern came to the rescue. It was quite a while before Mr. Popper got his pet safely into the baggage car. Mrs. Popper worried a little at the start over the idea of having Janie and Bill miss 10 weeks of school while they were on the road, though the children did not seem to mind. "And you must remember, my love," said Mr. Popper, who had never before been out of Stillwater, in spite of his dreams of distant countries, "that travel is very broadening." From the start, the Penguins were a riotous success. Even their opening performance in Seattle went off without a hitch, probably because they had already rehearsed on a real stage. It was here that the Penguins added a little novelty number of their own to the program. They were the first thing on the bill. When they finished their regular act, the audience went wild. They clapped and stamped and roared for more of Popper's performing Penguins. Janie and Bill helped their father herd the Penguins off the stage so the next act could go on. This next act was a tightrope walker named Monsieur Duval. The trouble was that instead of watching him from the wings as they should have done, meaning off of the stage, the Penguins got interested and walked out on the stage again to watch him more closely. Unfortunately, at this moment, Monsieur Duval was doing a very difficult dance on the wire overhead. The audience, of course, had thought that the Penguins were all through and were very much pleased to see them return and line up with their backs to the audience and look at Monsieur Duval dancing so carefully on the wire high above them. This made everyone laugh so hard that Monsieur Duval lost his balance. "Nork," said the Penguins, waddling away hurriedly, in order not to be under him when he fell. Cleverly regaining his balance, Monsieur Duval caught the wire by the inside of his elbow and saved himself. He was very angry when he saw the Popper performing Penguins, opening wide their 12 red beaks as if they were laughing at him. "Go away, you stupid things," he said to them in French. "Nork," said the Penguins, pretending not to understand, and making remarks to each other in Penguin language about Monsieur Duval. And whenever they appeared, the more they interfered with the other acts on the program, the better the audiences liked them. Chapter 17, Fame. The Birds soon became so famous that whenever it was known that the Popper performing Penguins were to appear in any theater, the crowds would stand in line for half a mile down the street, waiting their turn to buy tickets. The other actors on the program were not always so pleased, however. Once in Minneapolis, a celebrated lady opera singer got very much annoyed when she heard that the Popper Penguins were to appear on the same program. In fact, she refused to go on the stage unless the Penguins were put away. So the stagehands helped Mr. and Mrs. Popper and the children get the Birds off the stage and downstairs to a basement under the stage, while the manager guarded the stage entrance to make sure the Penguins did not get past. Down in the basement, the Birds soon discovered another little flight of steps going up, and in another minute, the audience was shrieking with laughter as the Penguins' heads suddenly appeared one by one in the orchestra pit where the musicians were playing. The musicians kept on playing, and the lady on the stage, when she saw the Penguins, sang all the louder to show how angry she was. The audience was laughing so hard that nobody could hear the words of her song. Mr. Popper, who had followed the Penguins up the stairs, stopped when he saw that it led to the orchestra pit. "I don't think I'm supposed to go up there with the musicians," he told Mrs. Popper. "Well, the Penguins did," said Mrs. Popper. "Papa, you'd better get them off before they start biting the pegs and strings off the fiddles," said Bill. "Oh dear, I just don't know what to do," said Mr. Popper, sitting down helplessly on the top step. "Then I will catch the Penguin," said Mrs. Popper, climbing up past him, with Janie and Bill following. When they saw Mrs. Popper coming after them, the Penguins felt very guilty, because they knew they did not belong there. So they jumped onto the stage, ran over the floodlights, and hid under the singing lady's blue skirts. That stopped the singing entirely, except for one high, shrill note that had not been written in the music. The Birds loved the bright lights of the theater and the great laughing audiences and all the traveling. There was always something new to see. From Stillwater out to the Pacific coast they traveled. It was a long way now to the little house at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, where the Poppers had to worry about whether their money would hold out until spring. And every week they got a check for $5,000. When they were not actually playing in some theater or traveling on trains between cities, their life was spent in the larger hotels. Now and then, a startled hotel keeper would object to having the birds register there. "Why, we don't even allow lapdogs in this hotel," he would say. "Yes, but do you have any rule against penguins?" Mr. Popper would ask. Then the hotel keeper would have to admit that there was no rule at all about penguins. And of course, when he saw how neat the penguins were, and how other guests came to his hotel in the hope of seeing them, he was very glad to have them. You might think that a large hotel would offer a great many opportunities for mischief to a lot of penguins, but they behaved very well. On the whole, never doing anything worse than riding up and down too often in the elevators and occasionally biting the brass buttons off some bellboy's uniform. $5,000 a week may sound like a great deal of money, and yet the Poppers were far from rich. It was quite expensive to live in grand hotels and travel around in taxicabs. Mr. Popper often thought that the Penguins could just as well have walked back and forth between hotels and theaters, but every one of their walks looked so much like a parade that it always tied up the traffic. So Mr. Popper, who never liked to be a nuisance to anyone, always took taxis instead. It was expensive to have huge cakes of ice brought up to their hotel rooms to cool the penguins. Let's talk about that for a second. This is 1938. And in 1938, they don't have a lot of things that we have now. And one of the things they don't have is air conditioning. So a lot of times today, we have furnaces to keep our houses warm, which they would have had furnaces. Air conditioning was something that wasn't really around in 1938. So they couldn't just set their thermostat lower and have it cool off. And in a lot of hotels, you can't really open windows. So they had to have cakes of ice brought in. That was the only way to cool things off back in 1938. It was expensive to have huge cakes of ice brought up to their hotel rooms to cool the penguins. The bills in the fine restaurants, where the Poppers often took their meals, were often dreadfully high. Fortunately, however, the penguins' food had stopped being an expense to them. On the road, they had to give up having tank cars of live fish shipped to them because it was so hard to get deliveries on time. So they went back to feeding the birds on canned shrimps. This cost them absolutely nothing, for Mr. Popper had written a testimonial saying, Poppers performing penguins thrive on Owen's oceanic shrimp. This statement, with a picture of the 12 penguins, was printed in all the leading magazines, and the Owens Oceanic Shrimp Company gave Mr. Popper an order that was good for free cans of shrimps at any grocery store anywhere in the country. Several other companies, such as the Great Western Spinach Growers Association and the Energetic Breakfast Oats Company, wanted him to recommend their product too, and offered him large sums of cash. But the penguins simply refused to eat spinach or oats, and Mr. Popper was much too honest to say they would, even though he knew the money would have come in handy. From the Pacific coast, they turned east again to cross the continent. They had time enough on this brief tour to touch only the larger cities. After Minneapolis, nice. After Minneapolis, they played Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. Wherever they went, their reputation traveled ahead of them. When, early in April, they reached Boston, huge crowds awaited them in the railway station. Up to now, it had not been too difficult to keep the penguins comfortable, but a warm spring wind was blowing across Boston Common, and at the hotel, Mr. Popper had to have the ice brought up to his rooms in 1,000-pound cakes. He was glad that the 10-week contract was almost up, and that the next week, when his birds were to appear in New York, was the last. Already, Mr. Greenbaum was writing about a new contract. Mr. Popper was beginning to think, however, that he had better be getting back to Stillwater, for the penguins were growing irritable. Irritable. What does that mean? Yeah, like crabby, cranky, not too excited. Sometimes at school, around this time of the year when we're actually in the building, students, and sometimes teachers, get irritable too. It's nice outside, and we're stuck inside a building, and we're like, I don't want to be inside anymore. It's been a long winter. I want to get outside. Right? Well, the penguins have a bigger issue, because as warm April winds are coming, what are the penguins used to? Where do they normally live? Yeah, a place where it's super cold. So as it gets warmer, they're going to get irritable because they're not like us. They can't adjust to warmer temperatures. So they're going to get irritable. The other reason Mr. Popper is going to want to get back to Stillwater is what does he do during the summer months? Do you remember? Yeah, he's a painter. So he's got a couple of reasons to get back to Stillwater. But one of the big reasons is he cares about his penguins, and he doesn't want them to get irritable, to get hurt, to get sick, to, any of those kinds of things to happen. So we'll have to see what happens next. The next chapter is called April Winds, which is where we are right now. Maybe Mr. Popper could use an April snowstorm like we just got. Maybe that would help. Although, if you look, guys, it's supposed to warm up pretty quickly. So by next week, probably we'll be able to be outside in shorts and t-shirts again, because it's kind of the way April goes. Temperature goes whoop, 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 all over the place. So summer's around the corner. We'll get there soon. Okay? All right. Catch you later. Hey, have a great weekend. And we'll get back to this on Monday. All right. Catch you later.